Chinese economic expansion in Africa, Dr. LMadu4. Dr. LMadu4 is a law professor as well as the chairperson and the president of an organization called Pan-Africa. And of course, Dr. LMadu4, let me welcome you to the show this morning. And let me apologize for getting those terms and those your positions sort of confused in a real sense. But it only means, Dr. LMadu4, that when we talk about the implications of the economic expansion of China in Africa, it simply reminds me of a show that we did almost 25 years ago.
That's correct.
Dealing with Africa and China, when at that time I think that you mentioned the fact of China becoming more important and stronger in Africa, and since the Olympics and etc., we now have a different view in terms of what is going on in China. And so those are the things that I would imagine that you're going to talk. Let's start off by having some background information in reference to China in Africa, Dr. LMadu4.
Yes, thank you. My pleasure, to be back on this program. It's always a pleasure. Of course, most people, when they hear about, the current Chinese business interests in Africa, I think it just started today. But they forget that the Chinese have been in Africa for very long. In fact, as far back as 225 BC, the Chinese had trade relations, with Africans. And then about 1415, a Chinese admiral named Zheng, made a trip to the coast of Africa through Mozambique, Somalia, and the rest, giving tributes to African kings and receiving tributes back to the emperor of China, until about 1949, when the communists came to power in China under Mao Zedong. Because of the political situation in the world at that time, China's intent was to cultivate the so-called Third World, which means Africa, Asian countries, Latin American countries, then under the yoke of colonialism, to help them, become independent, and at the same time use them to balance the United States and Soviet power.
Good.
So that was the doctrine of the Communist Party, insofar as Third World countries were concerned. What they called fraternal countries and solidarity with Third World countries. It wasn't until 1963-64 that the modern Chinese relations with Africa started really. In fact, the first Chinese doctor arrived in Algeria, then under President Bembela in 1962. In 1963 and 64, then Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai visited 10 countries in Africa. And from then, China started establishing diplomatic relations. The first Chinese embassy was opened in Ghana under Huang Hua, who was China's United Nations ambassador later. Zhou Enlai formed alliances and friendships with 3 or 4 African governments at that time. Nkrumah in Ghana, Nyerere in Tanzania, Kaunda in Zambia, and of course the Zanzibar leader Abdurrahman Babu. From then onwards, Chinese influence started expanding. Of course, you understand in the 60s, Africa was still engaged in colonial wars. China was one of the first countries that started supporting revolutionary groups in Africa. Most of the arms and training for African freedom fighters came from China and, of course, Russia. And
of course, they had their own reasons for doing that.
Absolutely, they have their own agenda. Initially, China was supporting the African National Congress under Nelson Mandela. But when Mandela's group started moving closer to the Chinese withdrew. The same in Angola. China was helping Agostinho Neto's popular movement for the liberation of Angola. When they started moving closer to the Soviet Union, the Chinese moved over to support General Savimbi and his UNITA group. So that was kind of a Cold War interplay between Russia and China in Africa at that time.
And of course, Dr. LMadu4, we're getting ready within the next half minute for our first commercial break. But this is exactly what we wanted to deal with, because many people, as you indicated, believe that this recent relationship with China and Africa started, but now you're also indicating that the relationship now is a little different from the earlier relationship. And of course, when we come back during the second segment, we'll talk about that relationship.
Absolutely.
Of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The guest is Dr. Leonard.